Episode 4, Skeletal Muscle, Determinants of Endurance Performance. Welcome to the Oxidative Potential Podcast, where we discuss all things sports science and performance. I'm your host, Matthew DeRoche, and with me is my fellow co-host, Phil Batterson. Enjoy. Today, Phil and I are going to be discussing Stephan Van der Zwaard's recent study called Under the Hood Skeletal Muscle Determinants of Endurance Performance. Now, this is an absolute beast of a paper, probably in my top three exercise physiology papers, my favorite personally in the last couple of years. Really enjoyed this paper, read it several times. It's just that good. So what are the determinants of endurance performance for that skeletal muscle versus what we talked about the other day, which was whole body determinants of endurance performance, where we discussed performance VO2, fatigue thresholds, and also economy. So this is kind of getting specifically into the muscle fiber. What is it that we're looking for at the muscle fiber to increase endurance performance? So it gets into fiber cross-sectional area, gets into oxidative capacity, capillarization, myoglobin, muscle glycogen storage. Also, in the end, it discusses briefly training-induced adaptations. So how do you steer the muscle fiber into the direction that you're looking for with regards to endurance performance, right? Is specific training going to yield different adaptations for the fiber itself, and what are those? It doesn't go too deep into that, and we don't discuss it too deeply, but we do give it a good overview. Also, in the beginning of the episode, we discuss a little bit about diagnostic tools for testing athletes, or research in particular, whether it's ultrasound and metabolic carts and NIRS and things like this. So if you're not interested in that stuff, you can probably just skip forward to the paper, but I thought it might be cool to leave that in for you guys to listen to and just kind of get an understanding of some of the tools that are used out there for athletes and how they can benefit understanding their physiology. Also, last thing on this is I was still using an older mic that I had, so the audio is not going to be as crisp as you're hearing right now, unfortunately, but it's still good. It's an improvement of the episodes before, kind of. So yeah, you won't have to hear much more of that mic in the future, but I kind of adjusted the audio, so it turned out all right. Yeah, so hopefully you guys enjoy, and if any questions or if you are looking for information, it'll be in the show notes. But if you have any questions, just reach out to Phil and I on Instagram or wherever, and we'll try and answer anything that you have or anything that we talked about. So cheers, folks. Enjoy.
Yeah, him and I had a really good conversation about the use of Moxie Monitor for like limiter assessment, and
Yeah.
how in an ideal world, right, you would have lots of different Moxies on different muscle masses and muscle groups and all this sort of stuff. And he was like, I don't think one is adequate, but I also don't think 15 is necessary,
Yeah.
due to
Yeah.
his testing and whatnot. So it would be interesting just to see, it's like in science, it's really easy to go down this rabbit hole of like what is optimal
Yeah.
versus like taking a step back and being like, what's actually useful and what
Yeah.
gets me the amount of information
95.
without overwhelming me. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I was actually going through, which we'll get into later on here in the podcast, hopefully, is your research paper. And I was drooling over the technology that you guys had access to, even though there wasn't like a ton there, but like the Oxymon and the inflation there, the Hawkinson, I think it is.
Yep.
And the ultrasound, I'm like, oh, dude, if I could get my hands on an ultrasound,
Oh man.
oh man, it's just
Yeah, if you want to spend, like if you bought everything brand new, it'd be, like 100 plus
100 grand.
$1,000.
Yeah,
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 just absolutely ridiculous. Um, but yeah, I think like it's again though, it goes like, what is useful and then what is necessary. And in research, right, we are almost held to a higher standard with like publications and those sort of things. So we felt it was necessary to use something like the ultrasound to measure adipose tissue thickness and skin thickness and those sort of things.
yeah.
Whereas, let's be honest, like in practice, just using a skin fold caliper,
Skin fold.
where
Yeah, yeah,
your NIRS device is going to be is probably going to be good enough.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, but
Yeah, that's actually funny with ultrasound. This is something hopefully Inigo saw Milan. He has a technology called muscle sound. I don't know if you've
mhm.
heard of it.
Yeah, the
Yeah, so that
glycogen measuring thing.
exactly right.
Yeah.
And I looked into it because I didn't set up a consult yet with them, but you apparently it's fairly decent for adipose thickness, obviously, right, and muscle cross-sectional density, some of these things, which is interesting.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
for the price that it's at, right?
What does it cost?
I think it's 5,000 US. So I
Okay.
mean that's a fairly good, even if it's in the ballpark, it's like, yeah,
Mhm.
that beats $50,000 or
Yeah.
$20,000.
Yeah. And that's the same thing we've talked about with like metabolic monitoring and stuff is like, it's like the Parvo is like, $30 to $50,000. Whereas
Yeah.
like a VO2 master, granted it doesn't have CO2 quite yet,
Yeah.
is what, 5,000,
Yeah, I think
5 to
five.
8,000, something like that.
Yeah.
So it's like I'm willing to take the price, the price difference and get
Yeah.
maybe a little bit less accuracy.
Yeah.
But at
And the
the same time,
portability.
yeah, and the portability. But at the same time, it's like I think I'm a firm believer that testing is almost is like the most important thing. Like the testing protocol that you do is
Yeah.
more important than the actual technology's accuracy.
Exactly.
And what I mean by that is like, you could have, say 3 to 5% variability in something like bioelectrical impedance, right?
Yeah.
If you repeat that same test, you have somebody come in at 7 a.m. drinking, 2 cups of water, 2 hours beforehand, nothing else, coming off of an easy exercise bout and those sort of things. That's going to be way better than just getting somebody randomly in, who might have drank a bunch of water before they came in or something like that and do a DEXA scan, right? Even though the DEXA is like technically the gold standard for things.
Exactly.
So people ask me that question all the time is like, what's actually the best for physiological testing? Like, is it this device or is it this device? And then I ask them, like, well, what's your protocol? Like, do you keep everything consistent over time? And are you, just repeating that measure over time, or are you, switching from one thing to another, to another, to another? Because if you're doing that, essentially your numbers are going to be crap. Like, how, yeah. So
yeah, lactate, heart rate, all these things are everything you can think of, whether it's down to the lowest scale or the highest scale. They're all affected by protocols and all the other factors that go into it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and just before we actually dive into what our topic is for today, I'm listening to a podcast with Jem Arnold about like fatigue thresholds, and him and the other guy who's on the podcast, and I apologize, I don't remember his name right now. Essentially, like, don't necessarily believe in fatigue thresholds as like the exact number. Say, like a lot of people are like, well, my critical power is 300 watts. It's like, that is a mechanical threshold that is going to change on a day to day to even within an exercise intensity basis.
Exactly.
So, and, it could change based on the testing protocol. If you do a 3-minute testing protocol, if you do, like a 3-minute all out, 12-minute all out, if you do, multiple all outs, like,
how you calculated that, because there's different ways of calculate it. Did you actually hit failure? Because let's be honest, that's a bucket in itself to dig into.
But again, the bottom line is like, it's useful if you're repeating that test, the same test, over time. I think that is where the true value is, and then using it along with all the other information that you're gathering as a coach to say, oh, well, like this athlete's super stressed today. Their glycogen is a little low from the high intensity interval training, so therefore their critical power might be a little lower than 300 today. Like, you can't just be so attached to like that one number or that one heart rate zone that like, oh, I know that at 155 beats per minute, I transition from fat max to, like decreases in fat oxidations. Like, yeah,
it's too narrow. The thing that I was just thinking about yesterday, I've thought about this so many times before, is when we get someone into the lab and we put a mask on them, or we're checking whatever, lactate, whatever we're doing, we always have them come in relatively fresh. How much time do you spend training relatively fresh? So when people say, oh, my VT1 today was this, so I can't go over this number whatsoever in training or whatever for this interval, and it's like, okay, but how much time do you actually spend in the state where you took that test in, right? Where you had like one full day off, you didn't smash yourself the day before that. And it's like very rarely. So do you think if you were to train straight through and get tested, that those numbers would be the same? I haven't seen that to be the case, right? So that's why it's always like, we go into these rabbit holes of like, okay, how do we get what we're looking for? What are we actually looking for? Peak numbers, peak metrics, or training information to base our training off of.
Yeah. Or do we start to integrate technology into our actual, like training that can monitor those sort of things in real time?
Yeah.
And that takes a lot more work, right? Because then you as the coach and the athlete have to be present, and you have to be communicating with each other, to be able, so it just adds another level of, complexity to the whole idea of like, what is optimal training?
Yeah.
But I mean, that's kind of a perfect caveat into, kind of our continued discussion of these predictors of performance and everything. And man, it's been a while since I actually read this Van der Zwaard paper. And
That's
so
okay,
question for you, are
times.
you? Yeah, no, it's so good, but it's been a while, but then I was like recognizing, I was like, man, they do a really good job of kind of walking you through everything that's been done in the past, and then, what we need to do in the field going forward. And this is from Frontiers in Sports and Active Living. And if you happen to be doing like show notes, I think it would be really useful for people to have access to this in the show notes, because it is open access.
100%.
Yeah, so they'll be able to go in and dig into this and read it as they want, and hopefully ask questions to us too, because I like those conversations that can be had. So how do you want to start this?
I think we should start on, because we're going to talk about skeletal muscle, we should start on giving a definition of skeletal muscle, right? Because some people might have relatively, they might relatively be familiar with this, but just to give an idea, type 1 versus type 2A versus, type 2X. Histochemical staining, these things, why, what is the velocity of the shortening kind of thing, basic overview.
So we'll talk about skeletal muscle, and then we'll kind of take a step back, and I actually want to summarize and do a good job of summarizing, traditional whole body or macroscopic predictors of performance. And then we can start to dig into what are the actual properties that we're looking at, within skeletal muscle that could be predictive of performance, especially endurance performance. So, so big picture overview. I just posted actually an Instagram post on the types of skeletal muscle and the differences. So, the big picture is that we have multiple skeletal muscle fiber types, and so actually we got to take a step back. Skeletal muscle is the muscle that is attaching, bone to bone, essentially, right? We have cardiac muscle, which is in the heart. We have smooth muscle, which is around things like arterioles and small vessels. But we're really talking about skeletal muscle. What is supporting our bones and keeping us, like giving us the ability to stay upright or run or do those sort of things. There are big locomotor, big locomotor all the way down to our flexor muscles in our fingers and those sort of things.
Yeah.
So it's, if we start from there, within our skeletal muscle, we have multiple skeletal muscle fiber types. These fiber types range from highly fatigue resistant to extremely fatigue susceptible, essentially. The trade-off with those is that the fatigue resistant fibers are able to allow us to do things like have, like sit up straight, do our postural sort of things, type on a keyboard, play the piano, those sort of things. Whereas our, fatigue susceptible fibers are what is going to allow us to do things like deadlift really heavy, sprint, jump, do kind of those like necessary high power movements, especially for success in sport. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So like compared to, different parts in the body, right? And different muscles are going to contain slightly different, essentially velocity contractions, right? Because for something up in your neck muscles that is not super important for locomoting or for most sports anyways, right? Yeah, so essentially the qualities of the muscle is going to be dictated by the function of the muscle, right? What is the function of that?
Yeah, that's perfect, right? We talk about anatomy and physiology in my exercise phys class all the time, and how the function or the physiology of the muscle informs the anatomy of the muscle, and then it's this cool feedback loop that we get, right? So yeah, from a high level perspective, right, it's skeletal muscle fiber adapts to whatever environment you're putting it in. So whatever stress it's undergoing, whether that be, strength training, endurance training, or overnutrition with metabolic disease and other things like that. And what we're going to focus on today is the composition of these skeletal muscle fibers and how they can potentially be affecting overall endurance performance. So yeah, from that perspective, that was a very brief primer. I have like 2 lectures that are like 2 hours long about like different skeletal muscle fiber types, and we can revisit this in more detail later. Maybe we'll do the Schifano Reggiani skeletal muscle paper. That is just an absolutely insane view. But before we go into that, or before we kind of go back to the performance, we have 3 muscle fiber types in human skeletal muscle: type 1 fibers, type 2A fibers, and type 2X fibers. Type 1 fibers are generally thought of as our fatigue resistant endurance fibers. Type 2A are kind of our middle of the road, jack of all trades. They could be kind of endurance based, or they can be highly power output based. Then we have our type 2X fibers. Our type 2X fibers are those fibers that really only get used when you're doing things like maximal speed jumping, or sprinting, or super heavy weightlifting, or going to fatigue. But that's kind of a tangent we don't need to go into quite yet. So the, like you were saying, the composition of our fibers, or the composition of our muscle, is going to be generally dictated by what the muscle is used for. So in the gastroc, So the powerful muscle that basically allows for your ankle to flex, that's going to be higher proportion of type 2X fibers because of the use of it. Right underneath your gastroc is your soleus. Your soleus is more of a postural muscle. So you see a lot more type 1 fibers within that because it needs to be fatigue resistant.
Exactly.
So with that as kind of like the caveat to keep in mind, our 3 fiber types and what they do, let's take a step back and go just kind of into the introduction of the review. And what I wanted to just briefly touch on, because I don't think I did a great job of touching on why things like VO2 max, lactate threshold, and efficiency are important for performance last week. So the identification of this like framework of what actually predicts performance from a physiological basis started with Coyle and Joyner from that paper we discussed last week in 2008, where they said, well, we've noticed that people with a high ability maximal rate of oxygen consumption, or VO2 max, along with high fatigue threshold, so that point or that boundary where exercise goes from sustainable to non-sustainable, and the ability to translate your chemical energy into mechanical energy with efficiency or economy, all kind of play a role in sports performance. The authors in this paper do a really good job of basically saying that not only do we have all 3 of those variables, but the combination of the different variables actually is kind of what's dictating performance outcome, because performance is just the power or the speed you can maintain for a given amount of time. And our goal as athletes is to get across that finish line as fast as possible. So VO2 max and lactate threshold combine to give us an idea of what the sustainable amount of oxygen consumption is for whatever the performance time is, from anywhere from 3 minutes to 30 to 2.5 hours, right? With that performance VO2 or performance oxygen consumption rate, the combination of that and efficiency is going to be able to give us the speed or the power output that is actually maintainable. So say, for instance, you're able to maintain, 70 mils per kilogram per minute. If you're, this is going to be hard to do, like the math and those sort of things. If your gross efficiency, your gross efficiency basically says, okay, how much of that oxygen, like what is the cost of whatever speed you want to run? So say, for instance, we know that, we want to run a 2-hour marathon, and that requires us to run, 4 minutes and 35 seconds or whatever it is per mile for 2 hours. There is a requisite oxygen consumption that needs to be met based on, gross efficiency and your performance VO2. That if you can't maintain that, you're not going to be able to do it. As simple as that. So the higher your efficiency, the better you are at translate, or the less oxygen cost you have per unit of speed or power. So it's beneficial to have a high efficiency, because then you reduce the oxygen cost, which then spares the amount of strain or stress on the mitochondria, which means you can go faster because your mitochondria can you use more oxygen and those sort of things. So does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. Like it's good to kind of always start with a kind of introduction starting from the summarization of the last episode, right? So it gives us an instant framework to move forward from.
Yeah. Kind of that continuation. And interestingly, something that's been identified is that some of these variables, say like VO2 peak or VO2 max, and gross efficiency almost seem inversely related. So if you have a really high VO2 max, you might have a lower gross efficiency. I actually was contacted by a guy on my Instagram who is like, I have an incredibly high VO2 max, He's like an Olympic race walker or something like that.
Okay.
He has an incredibly high VO2 max. It's like 80 or something like that, which is just like absolutely insane. But then he's like, well, but my gross efficiency is actually pretty low. So you want some advice on, okay, how do I actually like improve my efficiency? And I'm wondering if you're almost doing a disservice to yourself by just trying to continually maximize your VO2 max, right? Like if you have in like a video game, right, you only have 100 points to distribute across all your attributes. Like maybe by distributing too much into your VO2 max, you're kind of lowering, like the ability for that efficiency to be high. Like what's actually underlying these physiological variables, the VO2 max, the lactate threshold, and the gross efficiency to actually allow these people to be such high performers. And what Van der Zwaard and his colleagues have kind of done is they say, well, it all starts at the skeletal muscle, or at least that's their kind of their bias, and I am also biased because that's what most of my research has been on is the appreciation of skeletal muscle and all of that. But interestingly, they start to identify like things like muscle fiber type, right? Things like muscle fiber cross-section area, oxidative capacity, and how all of these are associated to some extent with endurance performance specifically. So we can kind of jump into muscle fiber type first, I think, and then kind of talk through like, oh, how did this conclusion of like, oh, maybe more type 1 fibers is better for endurance performance, how did that like come about? And then I think that kind of sets the groundwork, because again, muscle like physiology or muscle function kind of dictates anatomy, and then anatomy is going to dictate physiology and so on and so forth, so performance. So if you want to start with that, I can interject when we need to.
So essentially back in the 70s and 80s, which is it's funny, a lot of really good research was done back in the 70s and 80s. So what they found was different athletes held different composition of muscle fibers, right? So different types of muscle fibers. So some of the long distance runners, right, and swimmers, rowers, kayakers, they were holding a large proponent of slow type 1 muscle fiber, 70-80%. Then you move into your middle distance runners, skiers, some of the middle distance efforts there, they were holding 50 to 60. Now, with this kind of middle category is where you see the most individual variability, right? Like you're seeing some people with still a high amount of type 1 and some other people with a high amount of type 2, right? So it's not always like people are 50, 60 in this category. Then you go into, throwers, weightlifters, wrestlers, these people are down in the 20 to 45% type 1. And then down to the sprinters, where you're seeing some as low as 25%, 30%. And the same with, the endurance runners, like the marathoners. Some of these guys see up to 90%, right? Same with the cyclists. They're seeing up to 90% in some of these guys. But they all are kind of categorized within this, high, medium, low. And some people fall outside of those ranges, but that's a general statement around the investigations that they did. So how do they do this, right? How do they find out if you want to go out and find your muscle fiber type? How do you do that? Well, one way is doing a muscle biopsy, which is painful. I've had them done before when I was younger, actually.
Was that like part of a study
painful.
or something?
No, just for some issues I had when I was a kid. So they took some biopsies out of my thigh. I still actually have the scars, which is crazy. Of some of the scars that have lasted in my lifetime, the biopsy scars are still there from when I was like 9. So like 20 years ago. But so this was a classical way of testing muscle fiber typology, right? So not super convenient for athletes, right? You have to take maybe a day off training. It's annoying to recover from it.
Especially elite level athletes, right? It's like they're like, I can't miss a day. We do biopsies within my lab here at Oregon State, and That's generally the thing that holds people up the most from participating in our studies, just because
Exactly.
it's an invasive procedure, that does require, we don't use stitches, we just use like industrial grade tape or medical grade tape.
Okay.
And we take, it's 1/4 inch incision, and then we take like a little pea-sized, piece of muscle biopsy. But people, some people don't even bat an eye. It's totally fine. And other people are like, oh my gosh, this is like such a weird sensation, like other things like that. Either way, the bottom line is that, it may not be the most
Best.
conducive,
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
it's, while it is the best for, measuring like, fiber types and everything like that, from a functional standpoint, not everybody's going to want to do it, right?
Exactly. So moving into some of the newer techniques here, well, one of the main newer techniques, proton magnetic resonance spectroscopy, right? So this is the big boy in the field now, and it's still fairly hard to come around. But some of these, professional football clubs, actually, I've heard, have bought some of these machines, and now the expertise is so high to actually analyze the information that you're getting from them. They have to outsource that to people in the field. But going into this now, what it does is it essentially measures the amount of carnosine in your muscle, which is a metabolite. And whenever they get the amount of carnosine in the muscle, the different fiber types hold different amounts of carnosine. So the fast twitch holding twice as much as a slow twitch. And so whenever they get this, they can kind of dictate, okay, what's the fiber typology? And it actually holds, in some cases, more accurate than the biopsies in some cases. And the reason why is because they can take a larger spectrum of muscle.
Yeah.
Whereas with the biopsy, you're taking a small amount, you're taking, maybe 200 to 300 fibers, and the specific location of where you're taking those fibers is going to make a difference.
Yeah.
Whereas this, essentially proton magnetic resonance spectroscopy, you can take a larger capture of that. So outside of the, highly technical expertise, outside of the price cost of this machine, so that's essentially how you would get one of these done, which in the future might be more available to you. I would say in the next 10 years, probably going to be a little bit more available in most universities. We'll see.
Yeah, I honestly, I haven't ever seen this be used in my labs. We haven't ever done, fiber typing. I can see why, using a muscle biopsy is fairly easy, right? You get a pea-sized amount of muscle. It looks kind of like ground beef or something like that. Maybe not too appetizing to people, but then you can just do a ton of stuff with that, right? You can take that, you can, you basically blend it up, and then you can determine, either based on immunohistochemical staining, or I imagine Western blotting you could probably do with detection of different antibodies. All of these sort of things. The bottom line is you can kind of get an idea of what the fiber type distributions are. But the challenge is, like you were saying, Matt, is that if we only take a pea-sized amount of protein, like your thigh is huge.
Yeah.
And it depends on how deep, your muscle biopsy is coming from, because if you go deeper into the muscle, so closer to the bone, you're going to have more type 1 fibers. If you go, further up, and then it's affected by adipose tissue thickness, all of this sort of stuff. So if this proton magnetic resonance spectroscopy, is as accurate, I wouldn't see why not, other than the cost, right? And hopefully all of that will be bumped down, and somebody will eventually figure out a way to make it so cost effective that, you can just like scan your muscle with a little like wand scanner, like they have in like the airports or something like that. And then you're like, oh yeah, you're 80% type 2 or type 1 fibers.
Yeah. Wim Derave is the main researcher that kind of spearheaded this stuff and brought it. He's got some good papers out there, quantification of human skeletal muscle, carnosine. Anyways, you'll find his papers out there. Read through them. They give you a good. Anyways, if you're interested in that type of nerdy stuff, there. University of Ghent in Belgium.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Yeah. I do want to point out. So this paper by Trappy et al. In 2015. So they're really big into the muscle fiber typing and stuff. And they found in this like champion sprinter only 29% type 1 fibers, which means that 71% of his fibers were type 2 fibers, and I think type 2X fibers, which are generally pretty scarce, was like upwards of like 29% or something like that, which is just
That's
absolutely insane.
That is insane.
Anyways, kind of a digression, but what they were noticing is that over time, right, more endurance, highly endurance trained athletes had higher proportion of type 1 fibers. In my mind's eye, it kind of makes sense, right? Your type 1 fibers are fatigue resistance. Endurance requires fatigue resistance. So it would make sense that then your body adapts to have more type 1 fibers. And also, as kind of like a little caveat as well, there used to be a lot of debate on whether or not you could actually change your fiber types around. And I think, at least from the more recent literature, it is becoming more and more more and more of like an accepted sort of idea that even within humans, you're able to have some level of fiber type transition depending on what you do and how long you do it for. Obviously, the longer you do something, the longer you put a stress on your body, the more likely it is that you're going to shift towards whatever phenotype that would require. So if you do a lot of endurance training for a long time, you're probably going to have a greater proportion of type 1 fibers.
Where do you want to go next with this?
Yeah, we
Talk
can
about this size or
we can kind of continue on. So with this in mind, right, the first thing that people are noticing is that more type 1 fibers tends to be better for endurance performance. And then along with that, they started to measure muscle fiber cross-sectional area, and they started to see an inverse relationship. So muscle fiber cross-section area, right, is like if you cut the muscle and then you just look to see how big, what's the diameter of that muscle, how much space does it take up? And generally speaking, the larger your muscle fiber, the lower the actual amount of oxygen that they're able to utilize.
They think the reason for that too, and this is not for sure known, but is the diffusion distance, right? Because the larger the fiber is, the larger the distance that oxygen has to diffuse to get where it needs to go. But that's a theory anyways.
And the just to kind of go with that, right, the larger your fiber, the farther the oxygen has to travel to get to like the mitochondria, because that's where oxygen is being utilized.
Exactly.
However, if you have the ability to deliver more oxygen by increasing things like capillarization or increasing your mitochondrial volume density, then that seems to get rid of this diffusion limitation in a sense. So you can see people who have larger, cross-sectional area, but they have a lot of capillarization. And that allows more oxygen to be delivered around the muscle. And then, that would essentially increase the partial pressure of oxygen outside and allow that diffusion gradient to be, or that diffusion distance to kind of be overridden in a sense. So
myoglobin and mitochondrial capacity. Yeah, exactly. All those things contribute. Yeah, sorry.
No, it's so from the perspective of muscle fiber cross-sectional area, we're kind of thinking about there's probably an optimal size, because the larger the cross-sectional area, the more force that muscle can actually be able to apply as well. So you don't want it to be super, super tiny and have no force output, but you don't want it to be so big that those diffusion gradients get messed up, right?
Exactly.
So from that perspective, it kind of is an interesting conundrum in terms of like, oh, well, how would we actually train that in order to, get somebody optimal functional cross-sectional area or fiber cross-sectional area. And I think, like we were just saying, is that it kind of comes down to this mitochondrial oxidative capacity in combination with capillarization and myoglobin, right?
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah. So what from a skeletal muscle perspective, what we need to do is we need to create robust mitochondria that are going to be able to utilize a lot of oxygen in order to resynthesize ATP. The more ATP that we can resynthesize from oxygen, the less we have to rely on things like glycolysis and phosphocreatine. And on top of that, and we can talk about the appreciation of the mitochondria, but mitochondria use a lot of protons in order to establish a proton gradient to actually synthesize ATP. And that's one of my advisor's ideas. And I think this is a little bit, and other ideas, but is that the mitochondria actually act to buffer a lot of metabolic acidosis that is coming from the hydrolysis of ATP with muscle contraction. Because with every muscle contraction, you hydrolyze ATP and you get ADP, inorganic phosphate, and hydrogen. That hydrogen can then be used within the mitochondria to establish the proton gradient.
Yeah.
And as long as the mitochondria can continue to use oxygen to or reduce oxygen to water and use the hydrogens within the proton gradient, the less likely that you have, or the less likely it is for that metabolic acidosis to start to occur.
That's super interesting. I don't think I've ever heard someone say that before.
I hadn't heard that either until like this year when I was talking to my advisor about how to teach, exercise physiology. And he said that, and I was like, holy crap. That's super interesting because yes, a lot of those hydrogens, right, are coming from, things like NADH, right?
Yeah.
When we go NADH to NAD, but it's not proportional. So when NADH, this is like a super deep tangent. So I apologize, guys, but when NADH gets oxidized within complex 1, 4 hydrogens are pumped, but only 1 hydrogen is taken off of NADH. So where do those other 3 hydrogens come from?
Yeah.
Most likely from, other places that can donate hydrogens, or perhaps, free radicals or free protons that are kind of like, floating around within the muscle.
Yeah. That's super interesting. That connects a lot of things for me right now in my head, and why certain people are trying to drive certain supplement formulations out there and certain I get it. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense now.
Yeah.
These proton donators.
Yeah. So that's kind of one of, my theories, is that more robust mitochondria allow for greater sequestration of protons. Those protons are generally coming from ATP hydrolysis. So if we can sequester more of those protons with more robust mitochondria, then we're able to actually reduce metabolic acidosis and potential for interference of, contractile mediated fatigue, and other things like that. So that was a long-winded way of basically saying, like, we need to have high mitochondrial oxidative capacity for performance to occur.
Yeah.
On top of that, we need to have robust capillarization because we need to get adequate oxygen into the working muscle. And time and time again, right, we see people who train more have greater mitochondrial capillarization. And one of the observations that Dr. Coyle made was that, these athletes with higher capillarization actually had, better VO2 max and better performance outcomes.
Yeah, that's held true with some of the newer research coming now out on capillarization and critical power, which there is a very good correlation between the capillaries surrounding the type 1 fibers, the amount, and that individual's critical powers number. So essentially, more capillaries equals a higher critical power.
Yep.
Also, type 1 fibers, more type 1 fibers, higher critical power, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And like all of this stuff starts to make sense. Is like, okay, if we have more type 1 fibers, we probably have more robust mitochondrial oxidative capacity. Most likely, that's going to also come with higher capillary density. And then on top of that, if we add in myoglobin, right, we need to have some level of oxygen storage to maintain oxygen tension across the muscle. So if we and what they find is that, you know, unfortunately not many people have done a lot of studies on myoglobin, just because I think it's still pretty challenging to measure. But they say typically 50% myoglobin concentrations are 50% higher in type 1 compared to type 2 muscle fibers.
This is funny because I was talking to someone the other day, and this was my theory, and I put it out there in the forum too. Was I think this has some of the answers to why we see certain phenotypes on a near signal. I don't know if this is true or not. Obviously, there's no research to support this.
Yeah.
But you know, we all anyone that uses NIRS out there knows there's these classical phenotypes. When you have a 4-1, 5-1 test or whatever, between these two types of athletes, one being more aerobic, I put in quotes, and one being more anaerobic, I put in quotes. I'm thinking that this may have something to do with it. Obviously, you know, adiposity is probably a player there as well, I think. But anyways,
no, I think,
myoglobin.
yeah, no, I'll kind of expand on that a little bit. So I was just reading a post by Jem Arnold on his blog that basically talked about the ability to predict power from VO2 max. And one of the things that he does is he shows differences in, like, you know, the power required and then your VO2. So what you'll see at the start of, like, you know, say a 300 watt interval is that VO2 doesn't immediately just shoot up and stay flat, right? We have VO2, you know, kind of eventually reaches, you know, like your 300 watt, you know, like, or
requirement.
Yeah, reaches a steady state in a sense.
Yeah.
And what he's able to do based on some equations that they've come up with is basically determine, you know, like the oxygen deficit. Oxygen deficit based on RER and a few other things. And we'll have to ask him about that when we get him on the podcast. But
that's interesting.
You can basically, you can estimate your anaerobic stores or your non-aerobic stores from that deficit that you get. And then you can also predict power output based on RER and other things that can be measured via just VO2 max, which is super interesting. And I think to make it to go a step further, maybe we could use that with NIRS devices, where we see, you know, like it would be inversely related. So you would have to do something with like oxygenated or deoxygenated hemoglobin. The deoxygenated hemoglobin myoglobin, is going to have a similar response as VO2 max. And then you're going to have your power output, and maybe that extra is some surrogate of either measure, or, you know, some way of quantifying like your non-aerobic stores. But if you have more myoglobin within your muscle, then maybe you'll see a steeper curve and quicker ability, you know, to reach steady state, because that myoglobin is going to be able to maintain oxygen tension.
That's super interesting.
So that's all hypothetical, and that was just a, you know, just like a tangent my brain just went on. So if anybody has any
that was good
research to support or anything like that, I'd be highly interested. And I know that NIRS devices cannot differentiate between contribution of myoglobin and hemoglobin. So we don't have the technology available to actually do that. But it would be super interesting to do some sort of comparative sort of study to see, oh, we have this distribution of type 1, type 2 fibers. This is the oxygenation profile. and then and see across a wide array of athletes how that actually works. So it all comes back to the skeletal muscle, man. Oh my gosh.
All comes back to that, which super interesting research within this review here where Van der Zwaard, this is actually something that is functional for the athlete here. So he did some research on some hockey players. Essentially, so he put 3 different models out there, which was one was kind of live high, train low. One was live low, train low, right? So this is talking about altitude, and then live high, train low with normal baric hypoxia. So they're doing most of their training at low altitude, but they're doing their high intensity sprint interval training in hypoxia. So what he found was that the individuals that were doing the sprints with hypoxia actually really increased their oxidative capacity by like an insane amount, essentially something that you would see way above what you would see in a normal camp of altitude camp story. And essentially, not only was it just type 1 fibers, type 2 fibers increased their oxidative capacity by 32% as well, where type 1 was 37%. So which is super interesting because when we're talking about some of these positive adaptations of increasing myoglobin, which happened with these athletes as well, and increasing capillarization, increasing oxidative capacity. These things are huge drivers for the performance, like we're talking about here. But we've always felt that training at altitude, especially at high intensity, decreases the quality of the training, right? So that's why a lot of people that are training at high altitude, they'll go down to lower altitude to do their high intensity work, right? And there's a case to be made for that if you're looking for neuromuscular adaptations, right? Adaptations of the nervous system. If you're looking to get those legs turning over quickly, that makes sense.
Or practice the speed or power that would be necessary for the race, right?
Exactly. For dialing in your pacing, dialing in your speed. But looking at some of the physiological underpinnings of that, it looks like hypoxia can be a great stimulus at high intensity to get, and they notice these changes after a week. Yeah. What some people would see after like weeks at altitude. So this was huge. That was a huge piece I found in this piece of research here.
Yeah. And I think it just highlights that the if you are able to induce a hypoxic environment within the skeletal muscle via this sprint exercise and lower oxygen tension, then you're able to stimulate HIF1, or you're able to stabilize HIF1 alpha with that, which then induces vascular endothelial growth factor, VEGF.
Yeah, VEGF.
And so you kind of get like a smattering of like everything that matters for oxygen delivery and utilization within that adaptation. You get mitochondrial biogenesis, you get myoglobin stimulation, and you get capillary stimulation. So all 3 of those are playing into the delivery, the transport, and then the usage of that oxygenation. And I was just talking to a guy the other day who has a hypoxic generator, and he was like, do you think it would be worth it to start doing some sprint training with that? And I kind of like, based on the rationale that you just said, I was like, I don't think it's probably necessary. You're not going to race at altitude, like those sort of things. And then after reading this for a second time, second, third, fourth time, I was like, I just messaged him. I was like, let's revisit that. Let's revisit that conversation real fast.
Yeah. I've given the same advice from the research that I've seen previously before too. I'm like, doesn't look like it's a good idea, right? Like the whole that's funny.
Yeah. So I think so we've touched on a lot of these like contributing factors within like the skeletal muscle and everything. And then what Van der Zwaard did, and you should try to get him on the podcast. That'd be really cool, because I would
he's a beast.
Yeah, he's had a lot of really good papers come out. But then what they did is they basically took all the papers that they could find that had the traditional predictors of performance and anything with, within skeletal muscle to predict performance. And they did a meta-analysis to see what was actually influencing each variable the most, and how predictive these predictors of performance actually are. And it's pretty incredible that, for instance, I highlighted the combination of performance VO2, so the oxygen consumption that is determined from VO2 max and lactate threshold, plus gross efficiency, could explain 90% of variance in 1 hour cycling performance in trained men.
It's huge.
If you're familiar with like R-squared values and predictive variance, anything over like 40% for a single variable is actually, is really, really good. 90% is pretty insane. And there's multiple studies that kind of corroborate these findings, like 90%. There was one with 86%. I completed a study where we took, tons of measures of, lactate or threshold variables. So we did lactate threshold, ventilatory threshold, deoxygenation breakpoint, VO2 max averaged over 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 60 seconds. And then like every efficiency economy variable that we could even, that we could calculate. And we came up with the best predictive model was 75%. Still really good.
That. Super good, yeah.
But it does seem that this model does hold up, right?
Yeah.
This model or this framework that Ed Coyle and Michael Joyner proposed back in 2008 is like, yeah, this works.
Yeah.
Now what we need to do is we need to understand what's the underlying physiology in order to better drive those adaptations to maximize all three of these. And just skipping down to the figure that they have, I thought this was really cool. So within their meta-analysis, they looked at effect size of the different variables that they identified. So fiber type, fiber cross-sectional area, oxidative capacity, capillarization, myoglobin, and physiological cross-sectional area. And then they basically wanted to see how big the effect size was for each of those to predict things like lactate threshold, VO2 max, and efficiency.
Yeah.
And sure enough, fiber type was massive, right?
Yeah.
For endurance performance, again, it's not a big surprise, right? You have more fatigue resistant fibers, it's going to result in better endurance performance.
Yeah, 100%.
But the big things, and we've actually, I think we've done a good job of touching on these, is that oxidative capacity, capillarization, and myoglobin all together seem to be that medium to large predictive or medium to large effect size for lactate threshold, VO2 max, performance VO2, endurance performance, and maybe to a little bit of a lesser extent, efficiency and economy. But I just think it's again, it comes down to oxygen transport. How well can you do it?
Yeah, all comes down. Yeah, like it's funny, but sometimes people are like, "Oh, why would you go down this far to why don't you just try and see what works?" Well, if we're trying to get somewhere quicker than the next person, it behooves us to understand what little things maybe you can do the same amount of training, right? Mm-hmm. If someone told you can do the same amount of training, but if you just tweak 2 or 3 things, you can get a huge benefit in your performance. And this is what all this comes down to, is we want to be most effective with our time. We don't want to waste our time. Everyone is limited by performance due to time, right? If we all had more time, well, also motivation. There's a million things. I'm just being I'm generalizing here. If we all had more time to recover, if we all had more time to train, these things, these are really the big predictors. The more training hours someone has is correlated to performance quite well, right? Also recovering from that. So if we can spend more time doing the right things by driving the right adaptations, we're going to see those performance gains.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So coming back to the guy I just did some consulting with, right? Maybe it's easier or it's faster to get to a hypoxic environment doing sprint interval training, to then facilitate capillarization, myoglobin proliferation, and mitochondrial proliferation, than it is just to do sprint training in general. Like you'd still get benefits from both of those
for sure.
But maybe what's really driving the underlying adaptations is that the ability to get to that hypoxic environment, which is going to stabilize, our molecular transducer HIF1 alpha, which is then going to allow for VEGF to, be induced. So it's about being more efficient with our time and utilizing what we know in order to target the adaptations that we want to get. And just going to their recommendations, I just absolutely love what they said. And I got to try to find it because, they wanted to have this go, like full circle, right? We've identified all of these skeletal muscle, indicators of performance that are all related to, the traditional predictors of performance. And then they basically start talking about polarized training may therefore have an advantageous mix of low and high intensity exercise for maximizing mitochondrial, myoglobin, and capillarization adaptations. Which is like, I mean, I think anybody who has been around endurance sports, for any amount of time is just like, well, no duh. Like so guys, give us researchers a little bit of flack because sometimes it takes us 10 20 years to come to the same conclusions that a lot of coaches, but all joking aside, I think this for me really does kind of reinforce like this idea that like in order to get more type 1 fibers, you're going to need to train at a low intensity for a fairly long amount of time. There's really no way around that, right? But we can augment our mitochondrial adaptations by doing things like high intensity exercise and maybe high intensity exercise with a little bit of hypoxia. As long as you have enough recovery, which is then that recovery is based on doing things like zone 2 training, which has been shown to help mitochondrial oxidative capacity. So it all plays in on itself.
That's the thing too, and we're gonna into this podcast we're gonna get into a lot of ways to tweak your training just slightly and gain more performance. But you have to understand that for some people, if you only have a certain amount of time, for you to stress about doing some of these things or finding a way to do some of these things, it might not be beneficial because that stress itself might impair your performance in recovery. But this goes out to people that either are very interested in getting the extra edge, or have a little bit more time to throw in some of these mechanisms or some of the resources like money to pay for some of these things. There is tons to be gained by just tweaking small little things and getting a huge benefit. There was something I was talking about the other day with a guy, blood flow restriction training. I think this is going to be a huge area of research in endurance training, particularly because when we talk about VEGF and a lot of these things with capillarization and the metabolic adaptations to training, if we can maximize things without let me pull this back. For example, if I want to get really strong, right? How do I do that? In my mind, I want to stress my nervous system because the nervous system, rate coding, intramuscular coordination, all these things are huge for strength. People talk about hypertrophy. Yeah, that's more of a secondary, cause and effect. We don't even really know much about you're dispersing some of that force over a larger fiber, but realistically, a lot of it's in the nervous system. So if we can stress the nervous system without destroying the muscle, may that be the way to get stronger quicker. And I've heard this so many times and I just didn't understand at the time. I remember hearing a famous Russian researcher talk about why would you want to go destroy your muscle if you're trying to get faster or stronger. And yes, there is adaptations from, you know, breaking the myosin head, actin-myosin, and all this stuff, and building a more resilient tissue. And you can gain strength that way by increasing hypertrophy and stuff. But realistically, if we want to train more than the next guy, what if we don't destroy our muscle and we get some of the metabolic effects for endurance, or for strength training, we get some of the neurological effects without destroying our muscle? May that be the way, right?
Yeah.
May that be a better way of doing things? This is the things I spend a lot of my time thinking about. How can we get more of
Right.
what we're actually looking for without, you know, adding on all these other things that we have to recover from?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it's like this balance between, you know, like what is enough stress that we can recover from and what is
Yeah,
too much stress that we can't recover from, right?
exactly.
And it's finding that kind of that middle ground. And I think that's why things like BFR and maybe hypoxic training based on this
Yeah,
review are potential methods of inducing more cellular stress without inducing more cellular damage
exactly.
in a
Yeah,
sense. Um, so I think with that, like the bottom line is that you most likely need to do a fair amount of low intensity stuff
yeah,
with sprinkles of high intensity stuff within there to help
yeah,
start to maximize your performance. And then once you start to, you know, to really get that down and have a consistent workout program, then you can start to do things like, you know, like the hypoxic training or the BFR
yeah,
sort of
yeah,
stuff or
yeah.
other things
Exactly.
like that. And so we'll leave you guys with that. And then, you know, I realized we didn't even get into my paper, but we can start
Yeah,
getting into a little bit more nitty gritty. You know, it's like, how do we actually stimulate these adaptations? And there's some really cool review papers that show, you know, low intensity exercise versus high intensity exercise. How does that actually affect the mitochondria and the subcomponents within that? So,
yes, yes. Very excited for that. Me and Phil are both really big fans of the mitochondria. We both get
yeah.
quite excited over something so nitty gritty.
Yes, exactly. You know, as always, you can find me at Critical O2. Um, Matt, you can find over at Resilience HPC.
Yep, correct.
And we're trying to post more stuff. You know, get kind of like the scientific the scientific background behind endurance performance and, you know, just exercise performance in general. So if you have any topics you want us to talk about, if you have any questions or follow-ups or anything like that, it's best to find us on our Instagrams. And then really until next time, guys, keep training and keep reading the science, because that's how we're going to optimize our training and our adaptations to performance.
Awesome.